Ambassador Bert, thank you very much. It is always very difficult for me to speak about Rick. Particularly, I agree with him on everything, including when he speaks about myself. But to be serious, we obviously owe a great deal to a number of people in this room who will be introduced separately and appropriately the way they deserve. So let me mention them as a group. Henry Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, Hank Greenberg. This was a group who was put together in a different way by Richard Nixon. Of course, Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State, before that National Security Advisor. Brett Scowcroft was Deputy National Security Advisor and then went to do other great things. Hank was not in the administration, but was a friend of the president and an important informal advisor. When I read about Nixon, and I did not know Nixon, of course, when he was president, I met him only in the 80s. But when I read about Nixon, I hear very often, it's almost a cliche, how insecure that president was. And I will defer to those of you who knew him as president to have a judgment. I do know, however, how enormously secure he was intellectually. And it required indeed a very big man to put together an administration of giants, an informal kitchen cabinet of giants, which really helped him to formulate American foreign policy. And the way his administration has ended, let me use Nixon's own words, which he shared with me on a beach of a very unlikely place close to Riga, Latvia, Baltic Sea, back in 1992. And he said, Dmitri, I made real mistakes. I screwed up. And he said, the worst thing for which I blame myself is that we could not finish the job. And I think that was not just Nixon's tragedy. I think it was American tragedy. And it was also American tragedy that I think for many years we stopped talking seriously about American national interests and about American foreign policy. Charles Krauthammer wrote that we took in the 90s a holiday from history. Well, I think it's true, but actually it was worse, because when you take a holiday from history, the assumption is that you take a holiday and then you come back home and everything is nice. You are relaxed, and you can do whatever is required even better with new vigor. We ignored history. And I am guilty among many others, because now, of course, we're publishing the National Interest magazine, where before we became involved with the magazine, that remarkable article was written, The End of History. And you know what is most interesting about that article? The brilliant editor of the National Interest, Owen Harris, thought that this was a stupid article. But because it was such a fancy idea in the early 1990s, a temptation was irresistible to publish, to promote, and then it became a cliché. History has ended. Well, you know, I felt very much at home, of course, in the 90s, because coming from the Soviet Union, I was taught that there is one theory, Marxism-Leninism, that communism was the end of the history of the mankind, that nothing bad is going to happen, and of course the Soviet Union would be a hegemonic force in the world. The Chinese ambassador is here, and the Chinese government even at that time did not quite agree with that notion. But otherwise, you know, some Brezhnevites would be very happy in Washington of the 90s. With self-celebration, self-congratulation, and a constant reminder of how great we were and how we could walk on water without getting our feet wet.
That is what our center from the very beginning wanted to discourage. I remember many things from President Nixon, but I particularly remember how he talked to other foreign leaders. And I will never forget a conversation he had with the Georgian president, Gamsakhourdia, who was the Georgian president at that time. And Gamsakhourdia came to see Nixon. It was in Tbilisi in 1991, and he said to Nixon, you know, Mr. President, the Soviet Union is in ruins, but that's not enough. The real problem is not the Soviet Union. The real problem is Russia. And one more push, and the Russian Federation itself is going to disintegrate. And I can be the agent of that change. And Nixon listened to him with his poker face, and then said to him, Mr. President, you know, there are all kinds of people in Washington who you are going to encounter. And there are people who will tell you what you want to hear. And there are also people who will tell you what you need to hear. I'm one of them. And what I need to tell you is that the United States is not going to war with Russia because of Georgia. What our center is trying to do is to remind people that decisions have consequences. That you have to ask yourself not only where you are going to be after your move, but where you are going to be after others, after your opponents do respond. And that policy should be judged not by intentions, but by results. If policy was judged by intentions, probably Jimmy Carter would be considered our greatest president. We, to put it delicately, were not always successful in persuading Washington to adopt our point of view. I'm trying to think what exactly we were able to accomplish during these years. I guess we had a panel on
Thank you so much for taking the time out to be here today. As a first question, I want to ask you, what inspired you to to give, to give to charity, to do philanthropy? What first inspired you?
Well, I'm a son of poor Greek immigrants. Came over here at the age of 17, not a word of English, a few pennies in their pocket. And they worked and saved so their two sons could get the best education money could buy. And I'm a very lucky American dreamer. And I've decided that on our current path, the American dream may fade because of unsustainable debts and promises that we have made that we just can't afford. So I'm devoting my money to that purpose at the present time.
So if you could give all your money away, where would you give it? Where would you put your money if you could give it all away?
Well, we're going to have to persuade the American people that they're on a very destructive and unsustainable path, and they've got to make some tough decisions. We've got to give up certain programs. We've got to cut certain programs back. We're going to have to pay more taxes.
So fiscal responsibility.
Fiscal responsibility. And if we don't do that, we're likely to have a major crisis, and we've seen what's happened in Europe. We're likely to have a slow growth crisis because all of our money and interest payments will go into funding the debt instead of investing in our future.
So what's the solution? How do we fix that?
Well, first we got to make the public aware of the problem, and we've spent a lot of time and money on that. We and others are making a great deal of progress. Second, we've got to lay out what the solutions are. And the solutions involve essentially cutting the entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare, protecting the poor, and then put everything on the table, defense and so forth. We're going to have to pay more taxes, and rich people like me in particular are going to have to sacrifice fully and fairly. We have to protect the very poor. But it's a period of shared sacrifice we're going to have to go through.
What made you decide to kind of support the Giving Pledge?
Well, I'm brought up in a small town in Nebraska. I've known Warren Rudman for longer than I can remember, and I've been a huge admirer. And he called me, and I do almost anything Warren asks me to do. So I said yes right on the phone. I was planning to do it anyway, so it was
Is there a philanthropist in history or currently that you really admire in terms of, a great philanthropist?
Well, I greatly admire the Rockefeller family, and I'm lucky enough to have known them as personal friends. And they're remarkably humble and generous with their resources, and they're devoting their lives now to bettering society. So they're a marvelous role model. I've gotten to know Bill Gates, and he's an extraordinary human being, and his knowledge of various subjects of philanthropy is just extraordinary. So I've got some great role models.
What's the most surprising thing you've learned in philanthropy? Are there any big lessons that you've learned about giving?
I've learned that you ought to, as someone once said, follow your bliss. You do something you're passionate about. Because it's not just the financial capital you put into these projects. It's the human capital, the excitement and the energy that multiplies the effectiveness of what you're doing. You ought to put your money where other people haven't already taken care of the problem. You ought to identify areas that need to be handled. So I've learned that. You've got to be able to tolerate failure because you're doing things no one has done before, in our case, and you're going to fail. But you can't have high rewards and no risks in life. So you've got to be willing to tolerate, take a long time, make some mistakes, and not be worried about making mistakes. Because if you didn't make mistakes, you wouldn't be doing something interesting or rewarding.
Are there any inspirational stories of giving or philanthropy that you would want to share with the Forbes audience, something that really kind of touched your heart?
I think what the Rockefeller family did, 100 years ago maybe, was to take the rest of the world and see
that people were starving and seeing that they didn't have the know-how to do anything about it. And taking the American agricultural techniques and implanting them, if I can use that phrase, in the poor of the world. And they saved hundreds of millions of lives. And I always thought that was a very inspiring story.